Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar talking about max aerobic development. My name is Tim Cusick. I am the TrainingPeaks WKO4 product leader. I'd like to apologize for the delays in this webinar. January, February is always kind of busy on the coaching side and has me running around a little bit. And it actually, it by far was the toughest topic to create. You know, it's kind of funny when you work on something that's part analytic, part process, and that process itself lives within a larger process. It's very challenging to put that together. As we get started, can somebody just type in the question box if you can hear me as I take a quick drink of water here? Great, awesome. All right, good deal. All right, let's jump right in and get started. We're going to have our normal webinar tonight. For those of you who haven't been on, please feel free to ask questions as we go. If you don't know how to do that, excuse me, you can simply open and close the little control panel on the top right utilizing this arrow. One of the options you have is a questions box. Once you open that, you can enter a question here. I have a second screen that I'm watching questions come in as we go. Please feel free to ask your questions as we go. I like to answer them right at that given time period. I personally don't like it when it's like, wow, I ask a question and then somebody answers it 40 minutes later and I can't remember why I asked it. So feel free, ask it as they come up. All charts that I will be showing today except one, which I'll talk about, have already been loaded to WKO4 and you'll now find them in your chart library. And the handout of this presentation has been put in the handout section, which you can actually find right around this question deal. Getting started as always, I'd like to put it out there that this is an opinion. You know, when you're talking about this type of stuff, as we know, sometimes online in different places, it can be very argumentative. It's not my nature to be argumentative. Part of our goal in the development of WKO4 was to give people analytics to kind of test, develop, vet, create a philosophy that works for them. And there's all kinds of science and there's all kinds of scientific arguments out there. This particular topic has some hot spots in it, all of which I'm going to avoid, but I do want everybody to understand what I'm presenting as my opinion, hopefully based on scientific fact and sound principle, but there is some interpretation, there is some, opinion in the mix. All right, let's get started with some basic definitions. Let's start with the most basic of all, aerobic. Aerobic really is occurring in the presence of oxygen or requiring oxygen to live. In aerobic respiration, which is the process used by cells in most organisms, the production of energy from glucose metabolism requires the presence of oxygen. The reason I put that in there, the number of times I get into discussions with people who believe that this idea of producing energy and breathing, right, how hard you're breathing and just breathing are two separate functions surprises me. The reality is, and I hope everybody understands, that oxygen is required in the metabolic function and it's part of the creation of energy. By the way, my other caveat is I'm going to oversimplify a whole lot of science in the name of not getting too deep and making it an in-depth scientific argument, even though, again, I'll answer questions as best I can as we go. So a simple answer about aerobic. Cycling is an aerobic sport. So much of the performance basis that you have is based in that aerobic sport, aerobic side, aerobic energy production. But, and it's important to say this as a caveat, a third caveat as we get into today, the development of the aerobic system is the dominant goal of most training strategies, but it's not the only one. So the point I want to make here is I'm going to talk about the development of aerobic capability, aerobic capacity, aerobic energy, a whole bunch of things that are aerobic. It's going to almost feel like I'm laying out a training strategy, and in some ways I am, but you're laying out one that's only a partial element of an overarching strategy. So just keep that in mind, that we're really talking about the specific aerobic function here. Even though we're going to lay it out, some thinking over time, it is not the training strategy, it's part of it. I would suggest it's a core part, but it's part of it. Next definition is aerobic capacity. Aerobic capacity is simply the ability to take in, transport, and use oxygen to sustain prolonged periods of aerobic or submaximal work. And it really is that simple. When we talk about aerobic, we talk about developing this ability. There's certain reasons why and other stuff which we're going to go into, but aerobic capacity is the core. Aerobic power is similar but slightly different. It's the ability to utilize oxygen in the production of energy to power muscular contractions. You need to be able to contract and expand muscles, relax muscles to pedal your bike, to steer, or to do anything else. But the reality is aerobic capacity is the ability to take in, transport, and use, and more specifically, the use is aerobic power. Why is discussing aerobic power sort of important? What do we need to know? Well, this ability to utilize oxygen in the production of energy, it is an unlimited capacity. Other fatigues might eventually limit you, but in this particular case, as long as you can utilize to bring in, transport, absorb, utilize that oxygen, it's an unlimited capacity. It relies on the abilities of the respiratory and cardiovascular systems, which we'll get into a little bit. Simple, most people know this, but just pointing out the basics. As intensity increases, so does the demand for oxygen, for O2, to sustain or continue to enable aerobic energy. So as you go a little harder, we're simply demanding more oxygen so we can sustain, continue, enable aerobic energy. Once sufficient oxygen cannot be utilized, there's a greater need for anaerobic assistance. So this ability, and what it's basically saying, as we increase the intensity of the exercise, we demand more oxygen. At some point, we begin to require anaerobic energy, producing energy in the absence of oxygen. And that's a transition from aerobic energy into anaerobic energy. There's components of aerobic fitness, central and peripheral. The central component involves the ability of your lungs, heart, and vascular system to deliver oxygen to the muscles via your bloodstream. And peripheral is components involved in the ability of your muscle cells to extract oxygen from your blood and use it to make ATP, the fundamental unit of energy. And again, an oversimplification is going on here, but the idea is you have these two things. You have this central capability, lungs, heart, vascular system driving the boat, and those need to be trained. But there's also a secondary set of training demands, your ability to extract that oxygen and utilize it to make energy. Final definition is VO2 max. Why is VO2 max really important here? Well, one, VO2 max is the highest rate of oxygen consumption attainable during maximal or exhaustive work. And the reality is that's the absolute cap to your aerobic capability. So when we start thinking about VO2 max, there's lots of things that relate to VO2 max, threshold, other factors. But when you start thinking about the absolute cap of aerobic ability, aerobic capacity, aerobic power, VO2 max is that cap. For a lot of people here, you've probably already seen the developing threshold interval or developing threshold power webinar I did where I gave you the example of the house. So it's really important just to remember that VO2 max is that ceiling. And if we don't have, at whatever point we train up to that ceiling, we're typically doing aerobic. It's an aerobic house, if you remember. We're typically growing our aerobic capacity until we bump up against that ceiling. And the VO2 max is absolutely that ceiling. I'm going to share something earlier in this webinar because it's going to get a lot of questions, and I've already had this question a lot, and you'll now find this chart within your chart library. So if you know we have the ability to track your VO2 max, we can model your VO2 max within WKO4. The question that everyone always asks is, well, what's my power at that VO2 max? So far, we've kind of avoided putting that out there, even though we can sort of do it, but now we're going to go ahead and do it. So the reality is you have a Coggins VO2 max history chart, and obviously this was supplied by Dr. Andy Coggin and credited to him. And it will tell you what your power at VO2 max is. Now, more caveats, right? And the first person who puts this out there, the first person who puts this out there is going to, I'm gonna make fun of you on Facebook. So this caveat, right? Power at VO2 max is kind of nebulous. So understand it's an estimate. It's not an absolute. If somebody writes out there and says my power at VO2 max was, you know, the model says 312 and I went and I had it tested and everything else and it was 321, I will make fun of you on Facebook. You know, we're using a model. The model's reasonably accurate as always, but it's nebulous. But the reality is it is so for another reason. So this VO2 max, when we start utilizing it in the idea of workouts, it can sort of drift in high intensity workouts. You can reach that VO2 max in a variety of supra FTP power outputs. So it's hard to pin it and say exactly because it depends on exactly how you get there, or it can be dependent on how you get there. Like, wow, this is your power at VO2 max. So just know we're giving an estimate of what it would take into account. If you've noticed, Andy is, we've been testing on Facebook and we're going to release a new and improved VO2 max calculation, which is included in this, and that does a better job of taking into account what's known as the slow component of VO2 max. I don't want to get too deep in that side of the science, but we are fine-tuning the model to make sure it's taking a look at that, and that's sort of what I'm talking about here in drift. There's lots of ways to go at it, but it should give you a pretty good estimate. And as we talk about VO2 max, I just wanted to put this out earlier than later because I'm going to get that question a lot. What's power at VO2 max? You now have the ability to look at it. This actually is a chart tracking the history of it. As we move into the webinar too, just remember though that we're talking about aerobic training, but elite athletic performance involves the integration of muscular, cardiovascular, and neurological factors that function cooperatively to efficiently transfer energy from the aerobic and anaerobic ATP turnover into velocity and power. I always kind of love that statement because it makes you remember we're talking specifically about training one function in the overall factor of performance. When we think about generating power, and I'm sorry, it was a little fuzzy, you're really talking about performance. You're talking about aerobic performance plus anaerobic performance times gross mechanical efficiency really is velocity or power that you put out. There's all type of factors that are look at everything that's related to this aerobic power production. Muscle capillary density, stroke volume, max heart rate, hemoglobin content, aerobic enzyme activity, you know, all this I bet you most people here are familiar with, so I don't want to go too deep into, but we're really talking about the development and the management of all this. That doesn't mean anaerobic and buffering, and actually touch on a little bit matter. We're not going to talk much about efficiency. A simple way of saying that sometimes though is, this is one of the ways I like to look at it, and it does drive some of my comparisons and relationships. You have VO2 max and lactate threshold. Those two items are very related. And actually it's easier to track most things in lactate threshold or FTP than it is in VO2 max. But when you think about it from a physiological sense, the interaction of those two really dictate how long aerobic and anaerobic metabolism can be sustained at any given amount of energy consumption. Kind of times that or run that through efficiency, and that is another way about thinking about how you put out power or speed. So that reaction, that relationship between those two are very important. All right, let's jump in, talk about aerobic training. So first off, with aerobic training, you start with some challenges, right? Aerobic training is very time consuming when done right, and when, you know, I'm done at in a desire to achieve a maximal aerobic fitness, it just takes time. And there are some ways to improve efficiency and effectiveness of such training, but the reality is it still takes time. It's actually harder to maximize than most people think. As a matter of fact, if you looked at, you know, 100 random mid-category athletes or Gran Fondo riders and stuff like that, I would tell you if you look at their training, they're doing their aerobic training incorrectly at a higher percentage of time than they're doing their anaerobic training. And the reason being, it takes a certain amount of discipline to do the endurance aerobic training. You need to be training in a very specific area, not too hard, not too easy. A lot of people end up with a lot more junk miles than they think they have, and a lot more trash miles, or constantly riding too hard and not getting quite the gains that they want. So the dose and targets seem easy, but it's more complex. You have to have the discipline to ride in this very tight range. It's funny, if most of you follow me, I was over in Mallorca riding with one of my athletes, Amber Neben, and I got to train with her for a week. So I had to ride with her for a week, and I haven't raced in 10 years. And the funny thing, I trained like seriously for racing in like 10 years. The funny thing is, you ride with a pro again, and you just forget how they just go to one pace, and they never stop pedaling. They just keep going at that rate, and you very quickly lose that discipline. Even me as a coach who does try to ride with a certain amount of discipline, you just forget what it's like. We're riding with her for a week. It was like, you never slowed down, you never stopped pedaling, you never went too fast, you never went too slow. She was, an amazing machine at it. So it's funny when you get back and you see that. It's hard to maximize too, because it has this series of diminishing returns. To continue to overreach, you actually need more consumption of time in general. It definitely is hard and challenging to continue the process of overreach because of different factors, which I'm going to touch on. It's more than one system. So, when you start talking about the challenges, meaning when I mean there's more than one system, in opinion, is there is a diverse series of philosophies about building aerobic fitness out there, of which I'm going to go into them. And there's a lot of argument and discussion about those. And there's a lot of literature that has evolved, ranging from, the old-fashioned long, slow distance to now everything wants to be high intensity. So we'll get into that. But it's confusing because there are a lot of options. And finally, it's harder to achieve full aerobic fitness than we think due to the key limitation of most riders. The key limitation of most riders is time, right? So if you're the average category racer or Gran Fondo rider, you're probably training somewhere between 10 to 14 hours a week, and that's about as much as you can squeeze out with that job and family and kids and life and everything else. So the reality, one of the biggest limiters to your aerobic fitness, your aerobic foundation, is time. And it's also why trying to figure out ways to maximize that, improve the efficiency of that training is important. When I said there's a lot of opinions and systems, let's look at some general formats of aerobic training, and I could list more, but I just kind of want to take what's at the core of things right now. So if you think about this aerobic fitness, you have things ranging from high intensity training to high volume, low intensity training, threshold training, which I'm going to call threshold training, kind of zone 3, sweet spot training, you might call it. Polarized training. Polarized training has gained a lot of popularity of late. Pyramidal training, so which very similar to kind of threshold training, and just taking a look at where people spend their time and energy in their training. These five are just kind of a summary of the big ones out there, and then each one has subsets. Polarized can have 80-20, high volume, low intensity actually has some interesting mixes. But there are a lot of systems, and you have to ask yourself, which is the best for me? So let's talk about my opinion and the way I look at it. First of all, there's challenges to these different approaches. All the debates about it make it static or on a point under the continuum. No, it's 80-20. No, it's polarized. No, it's sweet spot. You know what I mean? And the idea there and the way it's presented you're looking at a single point in time and you're saying, I wouldn't call it like just one solution, but people look at it as that because the argument makes you look at it that way. Question I got that I should answer is, polarized training equals block periodization. Polarized typically refers to that you do a certain amount of really hard work and then a certain amount of really easy work, sort of like the 80-20 idea. Block training and there is forms of it, and that you're getting right into it, the idea there are lots of versions. So block training and front loading, and there's all types of systems to achieve it. But polarized, the idea is that you're doing some super high intensity work and a whole bunch of really easier work type of deal. Easy to find information on polarized training on the web. So besides turning this into a point and continuum, it turns it into an argument of right or wrong. For me, the answer really is progression over time. Multiple solutions can be explored, and tracking is the key. Again, that's the reason Kevin and Andy and I really set out to do WKO4. We wanted to give people tools to track what actually works for the athlete, because for so many people, the answer is individualized. And that individualization isn't just physiologically individualized. It might be time constraints. If I'm an athlete, if an athlete comes to me and says, I only have 7 hours a week to train, I might not give the same answer of what's right or wrong versus an athlete who says, I got all the time in the world to train. So understand there's different keys, there's different factors. You as a coach or a self-coach athlete needs to explore them by learning and challenging yourself and find out what works, because it is an individualized so this timing is an individualized progression and transition. One of the things I would say in progressing this, it's careful not to lose sight of progress and overreach in the process. You know, some of the times we make things more complicated and we get like, oh, this idea, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and we overreach. So here's how I like to think about it. And this really comes, this has been around for a long time. I'm not bringing anything new to the idea. It's just the way my brain functions and how I tend to categorize things. So when I'm thinking about this aerobic fitness, I tend to think about the training fitness relationship as chronic and acute. So chronic aerobic fitness, I should have put that in there that way, but chronic aerobic fitness is this idea of building aerobic fitness from below. Anybody who's watched my webinars, you've heard me preach that in a lot of ways. Remember that this is a multi-system focus when we're talking about it, which is you also have this idea of it's metabolic, it's neuromuscular, so it's not just aerobic. There are other factors in building chronic aerobic fitness, but since we're talking about aerobic, it's there. Chronic is the idea of building depth of aerobic fitness, and it still has growth of VO2 max. You're just doing it from below. Then you have this idea of building aerobic fitness or acute aerobic fitness, which you're pulling things up from above. So this is the grow in the house, this is the raise the roof, right? You're increasing that ceiling, that ability to grow aerobically, because you're moving the ceiling forward, the VO2 max up, which really is the driver of the acute phase. Multi-capability focus. As you move into the acute, you get some other advantages, such as some anaerobic gain, some neuromuscular power gain, but I'll get into all that. This really, where you have depth of fitness here, you have sharpness of fitness. Training fitness, performance fitness. And then again, you have growth of VO2 max, which is actually more the driver of this phase. So let's go back and look at our different aerobic formats. And I just added a couple of details here, a couple of quick edits. So high intensity training, high volume, lower intensity, training volume, threshold training, which really is higher volume, medium intensity, polarized training, and pyramidal. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to cut polarized and pyramidal out. Not that that's bad systems, but that tends to be the end result of the execution of a series of tactics or even small strategies. And then you look back and say, I spent X amount of time in these training zones, areas, levels compared to VO2 max. What I want to do is focus on these three, because it really, to me, is the driver of the progression over time for building good aerobic fitness. So you have the idea of higher volume, lower intensity, threshold training, which is higher volume, medium intensity, and then high intensity training, all with the goal of building aerobic fitness. I call these chronic foundation, chronic, and acute. If you think about them over time and how they fit into a periodization, again, most of you know that I just kind of think about periodization in a base build race factor. The chronic and acute happen here, and basically you have that chronic foundation, sorry, that's a typo. Chronic, aerobic building and acute aerobic building happen here. Now note, they're not exclusive. There's overlap and there's some reasons to do. It's not just singular in its focus. Not only are they overlapped, as you're going to see, there's some exchange of ideas that go on during the process. A little bit of definition and feedback behind chronic, then I'm going to kind of dig in for the deep dive. Between chronic and acute, so chronic is foundational and it occurs first. 6 to 8 weeks to build results. I mean, it takes a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks to really build chronic aerobic fitness. 10 to 16 weeks or more. It was funny, Andy and I had a great conversation about this. He would say 20, even if not more. There's a point where, as a physiologist, I think he's right. As a coach and understanding end performance, that goes to my point of perma-fitness. There's a point where you're just kind of doing, you might getting still marginal gains, but it's not worth the extended chronic fatigue that it brings out. So to me, 10 to 16 weeks is pretty much the max of the chronic phase. You focus on extensive aerobic training here, language you've heard me use before. It's important to develop consistency. So 5 to 6 workouts a week in this phase are important. I'd rather, and probably everybody's heard this 1,000 times, you'd rather do shorter workouts more frequently than longer workouts less frequently. And you're focusing on time and zone progression. When we move into the acute phase of aerobic building, this is a maximization strategy. And I'll tell you right now, and I'll say it a couple of times, the better your chronic phase, the deeper your aerobic fitness, the more acute work you'll be able to do, the more you'll raise the roof, the better you will perform. So this is a maximization strategy. It's 3 to 8 weeks to build results. This phase should not last longer than 8 weeks. And I'm not even a big fan of 8 weeks. I'm more of a 4 to 5 week fan. If you've done it right, because you're building a lot of chronic fatigue in here, a lot of fatigue in general, mental fatigue also, so in this phase. So you want to build everything well here, maximize through the chronic phase, and then really acute phases, it's butter on the bread. It's short, it's intensive, it's high return. It's a focus on intensive aerobic training tactics at the core. It's built on a combination of classic VO2 max and HIIT intervals, high intensity interval training. So it's a little redundant there, but you get the point. And even in classic VO2 max, I only use that language. I'm going to transition it in the actual example. And here you're focusing on power progress. Again, I'll emphasize this point. It really should be a focus in this time frame. So thinking about this periodization, what are we really talking about here? So let's start with talking about the chronic aerobic foundation phase and what type of workouts and what we should be doing in this phase. Then we'll talk about chronic aerobic as a whole. So starting with chronic aerobic foundation, it's pretty simple. Workout type number 1 is endurance riding. Workout type number 2 is endurance rides. Workout type number 3 is endurance riding, and number 4 is a little more endurance riding. So now you might be thinking, well, gee, is Tim, here saying long, slow distance and we just ride around all winter? Not at all. As a matter of fact, I'm really talking about this chronic foundation phase as more of a transitional aerobic training. You could use it as part of your transition phase, as an early first phase as you really kick into your base training, or as, the beginning first 4-week cycle, depending on an athlete's training maturity and their fitness. And it's really just as a short transitional introduction cycle, and it's a cycle, microcycle. It's duration driven. It's endurance based, driven by long, steady rides. Ride like Goldilocks, not too hard, not too easy. You should be in the middle of the endurance zone. If you're low, you're probably not, you're just doing active recovery. Not that that doesn't have some benefit, but you're just better off riding in the middle of endurance. If you're at the high end of endurance, you're just creating more fatigue for very, very little increased aerobic gain. So target that middle level. You're extending, or the extension of duration is the driver, but less important here. You know, if you can go 11 hours to 12 hours one week to 13 hours the next week, that's great, and maybe a little more, but this is a little more. It's really just foundation, getting on the bike, getting everything flowing, getting all that basics in play, and it really is only 2 to 4 weeks. Now, sometimes you can extend that, and I actually think this is a phase going on in training, and I know CTS, there was an article on this, which I thought was great. More and more riding is moving into the fall. The fall is a great time to maintain aerobic fitness. You know, riding's beautiful, it's fun to be out there. You know, fall seems to be extending all the way into December these days, staying out of any political or global warming argument, but which is absolutely true. Which, you know, the reality is it just is becoming more and more of a time to ride. So it's easy to kind of maybe extend or start earlier in the fall and use this as a foundation phase. Very simple thinking. So a question, is the endurance phase as it attains to FTP? Yes. And I'll actually show you a chart specifically on that in a little bit. Now let's get more into the meat of it. So chronic aerobic training, is this, how are we building the chronic phase? Well, we still have endurance rides, extended tempo, sweet spot, and occasional high intensity interval training. Now, I'm not going to go deeply into this because I already have done a webinar how to build this. So I'm just going to touch some highlights, and I do have the link to the webinar. And most of you who've watched my webinars know what this is. What you're really talking about here is extensive aerobic training. It's duration driven, time and zone focus. So overreach progression comes from improving time at tempo, improving time at SST. It's not being driven by power. It's being driven by our ability to build fatigue resistance, improve the aerobic system, improve how you recruit muscles. All of that would happen in this phase. And really, it's endurance is a base, but long, slow distance is not the driver. I'm not a big fan of long, slow distance at all. It may be if you're a pro and you like getting out there for 30 hours a week, sure, it plays a role and it still will get you fit. But I don't even like to do a lot of that at that level. Extended intervals of tempo, SST, subthreshold formats are what drives the boat. Extension of time and zone is the driver, not power increase. And you extend to a point of diminishing returns. Thinking about a training schedule, consistency is very important here, 5 to 6 days a week. You want to build to 60 to 80% of days are tempo, SST, or subthreshold interval. Note, it's days, not time. Days, not time. And avoid low power AR and high zone power 2 outputs, as I discussed before. If you're doing endurance ride in the middle of the endurance zone. Very short chart, and here's the link to the webinar. That's the Build FTP webinar, when all building it from below, where the house is, you know, the house metaphor is and everything else. It's great if you want to go more in depth in this, but since it's already out there, I didn't go more in depth. I'm going to go more in depth in the acute. And the reality is these zones are right off the classic cog and zones. There is no difference between classic cog and zones and eye levels when you're at level 4 or below. I put recommended percentage, some work interval duration, recovery. I don't want to get into it all. Again, you could watch the webinar. Most of you have already seen that webinar, so this would just be redundant, but you're getting this idea that it's mid-level aerobic building. You're simply doing a lot of tempo, a lot of SST, and occasional HIIT aerobic work, which we're going to cover in the acute training. The key question I got that really triggered this, because I get it a lot, is what do I use to know when it's time to transition? Right off the bat, that is a really hard freaking question. You know, it's funny, when I get the question, you know, I know, oh, it's just this analytic. And you forget, though, as a coach, and this is anything in any, you know, just as a person, you forget the role of wisdom and intuition and interaction with the athlete, right? It's so easy to just kind of think there's some magic analytic. You have a learned process and you begin to look for things that you sort of just know it's time, you know? And the reality is, sure, I'm going to show you 1 or 2 analytics right here that I utilize, but there's also part of it, I trust in the process I design based on the diagnostic of the athlete. And then I track to a point of diminishing return as best I can. So I'm kind of layering in that quantitative data with the qualitative intuition feel. So I wish I had a better answer for you there, but I actually think a lot of coaches on this meeting will appreciate the answer I'm giving you. It's somewhere in between analytic and intuition, right? And it's hopefully an analytic-based intuition, or maybe it's an intuition-based analytic, but it's something happening in between. What I'm tracking, or what I do look at looking for points of transition, is I do use this chart, and this has been loaded aerobic tracking to your chart library now, and I'm looking at the relationship between VO2 max and MFTP and its relationship to peak performance numbers. On the same chart, I do look at EF and power to heart rate, so I do use heart rate and its relationship to power for some of that. I have targets that are based off the athlete's historical performance. I do the same with VO2 max. So the reality is I'm always tracking the two, and I track VO2 max more for the acute, but the reality is I'm always looking at the two. There is no set number. The trick is, and these charts are set up to do that, it's based off the athlete's history itself. So you have to look back at the athlete's history to find, and that's what analytics are. That's what you're doing as you begin to, use predictive analytics. You're actually using the analytic of the past, their history, to predict what could be in the future. So basically what we're doing here is we're tracking the relationship between VO2 max and MFTP, and I'm also adding in a series of different bests, which I'm looking, actually this is part of a chart pack with some trend analysis on peaks, and I'm just looking for a point where returns are diminishing. I check for these where I'm seeing, top 10 EFs, greatest of all time, top 10 in the time range, and then I'm looking at a point where I typically see what I call a chronic target. So a chronic target to me is a historical point where I've been able to look back through the data, and I utilize that analytic and a little bit of intuition to say this is when that person is probably most fit, most aerobic, or ready to move on is probably the best way to say it. I also run a very simple chart. It's funny, I didn't realize that I used this as much as I did until I was presenting, because it is in my aerobic dashboard. So I'm always looking at EF and power to heart rate, and I'm really just checking the progress of the trend. And I tend to run I'll build a quick, look at last week, last 30 days base. So I'm always kind of clicking through progress to see the difference of the trends, and I'll compare them. And as the trend line diminishes, it just gives me insight into time to move on. And third, I use the VO2 distribution tracking. I just simply have a time and zone versus VO2 max, and this isn't a true zone. Zone isn't the right word, but I'm really looking, and Andy put this out, it's been floating around Facebook and everything else, and I use it maybe slightly differently than what he put it out. I'm looking at the progression versus different VO2 maxes. I actually have a customized one, to be honest with you guys, and you should probably customize your own, but I'm really just showing you the general one, and I'm looking at the progression of time and zone, and some of it I'm thinking about what's good for that athlete, where if they transitioned to before, go back and look at their history, and some of it it's related to overall volume. So 23% in this range, the actual time of that for an athlete training 25 hours a week is dramatically different for an athlete training 10, 12. So the reality is I typically base it. I actually, in my chart, I run time breakdowns of this also. So that's that's what I'm looking at. Somebody asked me a question, I kind of missed it. What's the name of this chart? It's called Aerobic Power Review. Sorry, I should have pointed that out. I forgot I cut off the name. Aerobic Power Review. They should be all listed as new if you sync your WKO4. Okay, now let's talk about, and I'm going to do a little more in depth here on acute aerobic. So everything that we just went over was covered, a lot of it, the how to build the base aerobic. I've applied it slightly different by calling it chronic and showing you how it fits in the time frame. But now how do we evolve and what is acute? Well, acute aerobic training is a maximization strategy, right? And like I said, the deeper the chronic response, like how well you've built fitness, depth of fitness, depth of aerobic fitness in the chronic phase, the more acute work can be done. 3 to 8 weeks to build results, 4 to 5 weeks to maximize, intensive aerobic training tactics at the core, build on a combination, focus on power progress. Nothing new there. What's happening here in this phase is you have this you have a change in metabolic demands. You're splitting of stored phosphate. You're actually competing aerobic and anaerobic system. That's not really a fair way to say it, but it is. You're introducing this idea of you're now utilizing higher intensity work or high intensity work. There is an anaerobic function that's beginning to happen while you're still trying to maximize your oxidative metabolism. It is so, I had like 5 slides on this to try to explain how high intensity work builds aerobic. Just Google it and you will find there's a lot of recent papers on this, and go through and learn it, what's happening there. The primary driver is VO2 cardiovascular work. So what's driving it now is we're going to push that VO2 max. How you store energy and the cardiac atomic stress. I mean, we're just going to go high stress, blah, 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 drive it up. We're going to pull everything up from above with intensity. Secondary effects, we are going to get some anaerobic advantage. We're going to get some neuromuscular advantage and some musculoskeletal strain. So the reality is, because we're adding high intensity, we are also getting other benefits. So to end, remember everything we're talking about now is using higher intensity training to build aerobic fitness. So that doesn't mean it's a training plan. There's still other things you might want to do to create improved anaerobic capabilities. And some of that might be related here, but I'm talking about building aerobic fitness through higher intensity work. So what does that look like? Well, I break it down into 4 areas. Max long intervals, max short intervals, repeated sprint training, and sprint interval training. Starting with max long intervals, these are full max aerobic intervals. So you have max, if you're optimized, looking at optimized intervals, you have maximal aerobic intervals. They are controlled rest of 1 to 1 or under 5 minutes. And I'm going to get into each one of these in more depth. And a sustained maximal effort. So it's not pure max, but it's sustained max. The intervals, just summary, they need to be longer than 2 to 3 minutes, and they need to be under FRC power targets. Then there's max short intervals. These are less than 45 seconds, or just target the full FRC or FRC Pmax optimized intervals. And they need to be greater than or equal to the FRC effort. So basically it's max effort with extended rests. So extended rests, I need to simplify the optimized chart, really just talking about 7 to 12 minutes. Repeated sprint training is intervals of less than 30 seconds, high intensity sprints, short recovery periods, and undulating over interval time. So 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off, whatever you put together. Lots, and I'm going to go into depth. There's lots of names for intervals like that. I just simply call it repeated sprint training. And then finally, we have sprint interval training, which is maximal sprints, full FRC or Pmax intervals, the same type of effort as here, but now you go to short rest intervals, typically maybe below 3 minutes. And that because you're maintaining a VO2 max residual, which I'll go into. So to me, these are the general classification of all 4 of the acute aerobic training formats. There's lots of ways to skin these cats, you guys, and everybody has to have their own opinion, their own system, their own way of doing it. But I'm going to give some general ideas here. Let's see. So let's start with max long intervals. So when you're talking about a max long interval, if you're talking about the optimized target, and the optimized target, you know, is a great way to go there, that's the maximum aerobic target. Or you can build them your own. They're typically greater than 2 to 3 minutes. Most people use 3 minutes, but I find that people with really flat power curves get to VO2 max can use or really target a little bit shorter and a little more intensity. But again, whatever works within your system. So target max aerobic around 2.5 minutes to 8 minutes. That's not a change from the historical philosophy. It's a controlled recovery of about 1-to-1. You want a maximum for me though, you really don't need over 5 minutes of recovery. And it's active recovery. You should be pedaling, you should be putting out some effort. Not hard effort, but you're not just standing on the side of the road. You shouldn't just, one of the things that everybody's gotten into doing like maximum aerobic on uphill. So you do, let's say, a 4-minute interval going uphill and you turn around, you coast down, right? That's passive recovery. So don't let your athletes or yourself, don't always do them that way, because that passive recovery is a different effect than active recovery. Do them on a flat and try doing, 1/3 of the watts on while you recover. So you keep pedaling. That's active. If you're using longer recovers, the longer the recovery, the more you should consider an active recovery, my opinion. The shorter the recovery, the more you might want to take on a passive approach. So that always climbing a hill and coasting down the other side isn't always the best way, because you're not maintaining much, or if any, you're more likely to recover your residual VO2 max. So the reality is buffer lactate, all those things happen with a more passive. So I like keep pedaling. So there's a lot of times I'll do that work on a flat so that we can, or a semi-flat or a low grade, so that we can keep an active recovery. You want low degradation between these intervals. It is okay to extend the time if that degradation is happening too quickly. We get very rigid in this world of intervals when we shouldn't be. We don't need to be. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a point where you're like, all right, crap, this isn't working, I need to go home. That is what it is. But it's not just because power went down some percent. You're still going max. The stress, remember the external number, the watt might be going down, but the strain is still there. It's only after a significant drop off does that strain really go away. So extend the rest more if necessary. So if you're doing, let's say, 4-minute intervals, right, or 5-minute intervals with 4 minutes rest, you could take that rest all the way out to 5 minutes. I wouldn't go over 5, so there's to a point I wouldn't rest more. Let's say you're doing 3 minutes intervals with 3-minute rest. If you're starting to really drop off and you want to do 1 or 2 more, you could rest all the way out to 5 minutes. I wouldn't rest more than 5 to keep the power up. So how do you track these? Track them. Here's a change in philosophy. And every time somebody posts, and I'm going to post some charts here and give credit to people who've done some really good work with VO2 max. And I'm a little old school as you guys, because people were making fun of me using kilojoules a couple of months ago. I still like to look at things against VO2 max, and with the introduction of Andy's excellent ability to model it and the smart work that people have done, just track time at VO2 max in the workout. And you can do it in WKO4. Some of you already know it, and I bet you a lot don't. And actually the people who have done some of the best work in this area, both of them are on this webinar. I'm going to give you guys credit later in a couple of screens. And it's, you're tracking this time at VO2 max. You really want a total net of about 7 to 10 minutes, maybe 7 to 12 minutes at VO2 max. This is not time in zone. It's not that you're looking at a series of zones or you're using classic Coggin intervals and saying that's the same thing. It's not. It actually takes you 1 to 2 minutes of effort to achieve VO2 max, power at VO2 max, right, and have the full VO2 max come on. So if you're doing a 5-minute interval, you might only be getting 3 minutes at true VO2 max in that interval. You might be getting 4. We'll talk about in a minute how you can see. But you can estimate 60 to 70% of the prescribed time will be at VO2 max, assuming you have the right power target and the athlete completes it. But that's for me, that's kind of how I think about it and translate it. And there's a lot of my secrets on here, so someday if you guys ever meet me in a bar, you owe me a beer. The reality is that it can often make your planning much simpler. And if you run that number against the VO2 max charts, now that we can track, you're like, wow, it's pretty accurate. It's a pretty good assumption. Okay. Let's talk about max short intervals. So max short intervals are target. You can use the optimized target of Pmax FRC or FRC, or you can just kind of say roughly short, fully intensive, fully maximal intervals for under 45 seconds. It's extended recovery. So you want 7 to 12 minutes because it's not just your heart rate that's recovering. The whole energy system needs to recover because you want to do everything at max. So you want no to low degradation between intervals. It's funny here, and I put it in as a note because just preparing for camp season and even being at Amber's new team's camp, it's funny watching people go to hit maximal power. Even at the professional level, you see athletes who don't have technique to sprint. Therefore, they're not really achieving maximal power. And that's a real problem in training. Just like going to the gym and saying, I really want to become a great, maximum bench press, and you have really bad technique, you're never going to lift a super high number. So part of this training should be thinking and helping your athlete with technique. How do you track this? So here's going to get interesting. And here's why these workouts never get done right, because it's really freaking hard to do them right. So you can track it the same way. 7 to 10 minutes at VO2 max, right? Now time and zone, there'll be a high correlation. Time and patience is a challenge. Think about how long it takes you sometimes to do a Pmax effort. If you're using like Pmax FRC, how many intervals do you do with such a long rest to get that amount of time? On the track, that's way more common. On the road, most road cyclists don't have the patience to do it that way because we think about a race or an event and it never unfolds like that. But the reality is that's an excellent way to build capacity. So if somebody has the patience to do the work and do the rest, it's actually a pretty easy workout. I mean, don't get me wrong, the full out max sprint sucks and you want to throw up when you're done, but then you chill for. And how many people have tested this? Because a lot of people have sent me this email or message that 7 to 10 minutes is going to be forever. And then once you get like 3 intervals in, you're like, thank God I have 7 to 10 minutes, right? So give it a try. All right. Oop. Next, and here's where we're going to get a little complex. I'm actually going to, open up some debate. So repeated sprint training. So I got more verbiage. I hate slides like this. I shouldn't have done it, but I still did it anyway because it's a little busy. So repeated sprint training, look, there's plenty of ways you can call these micro, beta, undulate. I mean, I think everybody understands the idea. Go hard, go easy, go hard, go easy, right? And that's what repeated sprint training is. It's an interval on portion, needs to be between 5 and 30 seconds to achieve a maximum VO2 response. So the reality is, and then you don't really need more than 30 seconds. That's too much. For this particular function, and anything less than 5 is too little. The recovery needs to be less than 30 seconds, and actually, I think I have it here as a note somewhere, I would say even 20 seconds. There's where the Tabata protocol is well tested, and that 20 seconds. There's some research that supports out to 30, but I typically like 20 better. But the recovery needs to be less than 30 seconds. Here's an interesting note, right? This is something that think about in how you prescribe or complete these intervals. If you are on stage, I have that backwards. It should say if interval, not if recovery. If the interval is less than 50 seconds, the on interval is less. I'm sorry. I do have it right. Too much coffee. If your recovery time frame is less than 15 seconds, do it passively, meaning you should just be coasting. Very slow pedaling. If it's more than that, then it should be greater. If it's more than 15 seconds, it should be active. So I know that's kind of counterintuitive. You might think about it the other way. So, and it shouldn't say, that's the typo. If greater than 30, it should say if greater than 15 seconds, it's active at about 50 to 70% of VO2 max. You'd be surprised at what you can keep pedaling through. I'll answer how hard the on. A couple of people just asked how hard the on is. I'm going to answer that in a second. So total time at VO2 max, target of 7 to 15 minutes. You can extend this here, and part of what the advantage of this undulating format, this on-off format, is extension of it. But you can estimate only about 10 to 50% of the total time prescribed will be in the VO2 max time, effort range, depending on the format. So you notice how much less it is than just doing them like the classic VO2 max. The classic VO2 max is, what I was describing as the longer intervals where you're just going on, staying on the gas. You actually end up with, more time in the VO2 max zone while at high effort. Here you can only estimate 10 to 50%. Now here comes my learning, thinking, and why I use these very specifically. Athlete's fitness is the major factor here. The more fit your athlete is, or potentially if they're totally unfit, but generally because we're all somewhat fit and coaching somewhat fit athletes, the more fit your athlete is, the less time these type of intervals result in time at VO2 max power. Because the on-off recovery, a well-trained athlete can recover faster. You'll see a slower lactate response. You'll see a slower ramp of the, let's call it aerobic demand, and they actually end up with lower amounts of time in the VO2 max. So I only use repeated sprint training transitionally, sort of from chronic to acute, but I don't use it very heavily at all in acute because of the 4 we've gone over. It potentially can be the least effective. That's why it is so effective when people say high intensity, where somebody gets off the couch, they're not very fit, they start doing a bunch of high intensity, they get fit very quickly. But then as my experience has been in all of that high intensity and all of that polarized and everything else, then they plateau and they don't get better, and then they actually start getting worse. That's because a lot of these techniques, once you get really, really fit, or again, get as fit as that specificity, if that's all you're doing, will allow, and it's not really built on an aerobic foundation, you quickly just end up with a point of diminishing returns because you're withstanding it better. You can track to get estimates using the VO2 max tracking charts, which I'm going to show, but understand all of this is very individual. It's very, very, very individual. So a couple quick questions. If you ask a question that has more than 12 words, it's only going to make me stop talking for 10 minutes. So I'll have to come back to that question. A couple of short ones. This is the typo. It should say if less than 15 seconds, passive recovery, if more than 15 seconds, active recovery. So I accidentally typed 30 seconds in there, so that's the typo. I will come back to your question, Scott, also. Make sure I answer it in the end. Sprint interval training. Well, this is the same idea as maximal interval training. And really the sprint duration is at or just below Pmax FRC optimization, or 20-30 seconds all out. Shorter controlled recoveries here. So you want that to be less than 3 minutes, but typically you might see a minute. That's approximately in that range. These result in a higher blood lactate accumulation. So you're having residual VO2, you're having to deal with that lactate. You're really building the ability to deal with all that stuff. You also have a progressive shift in energy metabolism. So you have a greater reliance on the oxidative metabolism with repeats, because you're not fully recovering in between. You have this residual VO2 being carried over, and it really is just creating a greater demand. And target time of prescription or time in zone, it actually results in a low time at VO2 max will be observed, but yet a very high muscle oxygen demand. And that can be a little bit confusing, but the reality is you fatigue out pretty quickly without the longer rest. So your absolute power is going down. So you're not actually hitting power at VO2 max as well. So you end up with less time at power at VO2 max, but the reality is it's an increased muscular O2 demand, so it has the advantage, remember, if you have central and peripheral events going on here, of working on that peripheral side. So it is an important part to put in your tool kit of aerobic building. No typos on that page. Here's a master chart I put together, and I really should put right up above here my opinion. The reality is, and I'm not going to reread it all because it's a summary, of everything I just said, but you guys can take a look at it, think it, edit, tweak it to what works for you. But it's a summary of each one of those that I just said. I did give a little bit of targeting in certain places to give some idea versus VO2 max, but that was it. Tracking and prescribing of aerobic building. It's individual by nature, but can be tracked using the new VO2 max analytics. Dr. Coggin obviously was a leader in this, got us VO2 max by modeling. I mean, think about how cool that is, that we can have a VO2 max modeling system that's generally as accurate as a lab, assuming your data is good and you have maximal efforts in the time frame you're looking at. Andy did gave us a tool, and every time somebody posts with it and works with it, you see me say, this is great, underutilized. Maybe I'm old school because I still use that type of stuff, but I really think it's important. Both Coley and Steve are on this meeting, so you guys have done, if you look at, and it's so great about the Facebook group, there's so many smart people doing so much great work. You guys have done great and fantastic things, and I'm going to show some of the charts you've done, and in this area of VO2 max that I bet you is going to be very enlightening for people here. Even though now that I've exposed your names, there's going to be 1,000 people ask you to share the charts that you have. So be prepared to spend a day in my shoes. So look at this VO2 max analytics. I'm going to show you in the next couple of screens. Remember though, in all of this, the progression principle rules here. So whether it's the chronic phase where you're chronically building time, duration in zone, or it's the acute period where you're reaching to overreach. In this particular phase, I'm talking about acute, so I'm talking about the measuring of acute. Progression is hot and intense. It's drive it to the max, get every single thing that you can do done, right? And this is the 3 to 5 weeks where your brain's on supercharge, you only listen to heavy metal, you eat nails, you do everything tough, and you just go for everything in that overreach progression. But be careful that doesn't result in non-functional overreaching or overtraining and or mental burnout. Very tough in this, because I'm talking about the acute phase. I should have made that clear. Very tough, this acute phase mentally. It can burn somebody up. And that's another reason you don't ever really, in my opinion, want to extend it past 6 weeks, 8 at the absolute most. The good news though, rapid gains can offset mental fatigue. So you'll move in this phase if you do it right. You'll see numbers, specifically or shorter numbers will move. So make sure you're encouraging your athletes, showing them those results. They'll move every interval workout. Prescription tips. It's very physically and mentally demanding. Consider this in your planning. Try to break it up with some other fun things. Recovery is crucial. And I'm talking about the acute phase. I should have put it here. Recovery is crucial. At least 48 hours between HIIT sessions to perform maximally. When you do high intensity training, it's got to be high intensity or it doesn't work. Vary the quantities. There you go. Another typo. Vary the quantities and format, but progress quickly. This is a short cycle. This period might benefit from some high volume, low intensity filling. So I do that in this phase. I'll always make sure at least one ride a week is a slow, easy, low intensity ride for 5 to 6 hours. Refresh the brain. I tell them to go out and enjoy. They have to, I literally will put this in my coach. Tell me 5 scenic things you saw on the ride today. It's actually a really good tip, you guys. Because what do most of us in these phases, and we're driving, we're training, what are we looking at? Our power meter, our Garmin. Look up, look around, enjoy the day, get people, help them recover and relax in this phase. So I got a good question about the prescription. And when I'm saying 3 to 5 weeks, does that include the off week? Yes. Maybe if you're just doing 3 weeks and you time it perfectly, it might not, but yeah, it would include the off time period. I'm very careful of saying a week. We tend to always think in a week we have to block everything into the 7-day perfect calendar week. It would, in all of training, you introduce stress, then comes fatigue, then you need rest if you want adaptation. So I file that format through those 3 to 5 weeks. Many different ways to do it, but I follow that format. So I use this, how I can judge this phase, I'm focusing more on the VO2 max and the relationship between VO2 max and FTP and actually moving the VO2 max. I actually use the VO2 max power chart that I showed you way at the beginning. I just don't want to speed through all the charts. Now, this was done by Andy did the base one, and Coley and Steve improved it, and they've exchanged it on Facebook, and it's really great. And basically, it's a breakdown of, and I know Steve did all the hard writing, even though I bet you Coley has a very similar one. A very, and you basically are seeing here, it's probably hard to see on your screen, time at VO2 max. So remember I said you could track it? There you go. So we have a chart tracking it that was created by smart people in the Facebook group. I stole it. I have one with some super secret other stuff on there, which I would actually share. Notice what they've done too is they've put some lines here, giving you insight into the VO2 max. It's in there, so when people go over it, very cool chart. What's the title of this chart? Lucas, I haven't shared this chart yet because I need to get everybody's permission and I need to get it from them, but my goal would be to do that shortly. So I'll work with Coley and Steve to get the chart into the library here shortly. We just want to make sure we have permission to share it. If you Facebook it, just search the Facebook group for VO2 max and it's on the main. There's a big long thread on it. It's in there, the images and what it's doing. And Steve put the expressions he used in there. This is the same chart when you break it down and you can look at it by interval. Excellent chart. Excellent use of the technology, whole new level of analyzing workouts. So that's how I measure items in the acute phase. Okay, that completes it. Sorry, I'm actually probably not that far behind schedule. 8 minutes, maybe. But I ducked a couple Q&A. So now is the time to ask Q&A. I'm only going back to the chronic and acute chart. So if anybody wants to ask, there's already 1 or 2 questions. So I'm stalling while you guys ask the questions. So the whole theory here is over time. And the theory of over time is that you simply are looking at all of these different structures and they all can play a role. It's not, be careful. If it's black or white or right or wrong, you have to test it, look at the data, and understand what works for you and your athletes. The same answer isn't going to be true for each of your athletes because of their individual physiology, because of time constraints, because of target events and goals, but you have the tools now to find out. I've given you a simple overview of how I might look at this acute. That's what I was looking for. Chronic and acute and how it transitions over time, and then training formats in each. Again, if you want more in depth about the chronic, watch the linked webinar that's in there. I just didn't want to end up being a 2-hour webinar. And you can have it. So let me start answering a couple of the longer questions. For chronic aerobic development, you mentioned extension of duration and not power being the driver. Are you letting optimized intervals chart drive this with extensive work or manually extending this before the next testing period? That's actually a really great question. I manually extend it. And as you watch the webinar I'm talking about, I think it was like you're always going at 105%, like just add 5%, you know what I mean? Because you're right, optimized levels and the PD curve itself is always trailing by 1 day, right? Because it needs that new data in it to go to the next step. And that's what you were pointing out later, so the model can catch up. Where does the testing in the deep non-competitive season when establish the chronic aerobic foundation? To me, whether it's the non-competitive season or not, testing is training, training is testing. You should always be testing. Always just set up the pattern of testing in 4 to 6 week periods and it works. So you might be testing the unfit athlete versus the fit athlete, but that's the nature of it. And how I treat it might be slightly different, and you do, if you watch the webinars, the difference between structured testing and unstructured testing. I'm a fan of unstructured because it's less stress and strain on the athlete, but I'm always doing it 4 to 6 weeks. Even when they're unfit, I need to know how unfit they are. I've certainly made the mistake of letting athletes get too unfit and then been like, oh crap, now we have to do more work than I wanted to do to catch up. Okay, answered. How does WKO4 separate base build race phase? Do we set this? Yeah, Derek, all you need to do is you use the time ranges. I built it. I don't think I have WKO4 open. I built it. You just simply go in and build a custom range. And you can do that by hitting the little plus or minus on the right-hand Explorer on the lower side of that, and then just set the days. If you haven't watched the Getting Started webinar, I did another one last night, go to the webinar list that I'm going to show you here in a second and find the Getting Started webinar. I'll show you how to manage time ranges and do it. Nigel, what exactly do you test every 4 to 6 weeks? It depends if I'm doing structured or unstructured. If I'm doing structured testing, I test 4 and 30 minutes. I'm sorry, 4 and 30. 5 and 30 minutes or 5 and 20 minutes, depending on what I'm looking at. For athletes, so longer athletes like triathletes and stuff like that, I use 30 minutes. I'll do that in the off season. In the on season, I kick off the on season with a full profile when I'm structured. So 5 second, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute, 60 minute. And then ongoing, I have select tests based on their needs, what we're working on, what the demand of their events are. In unstructured, I'm just managing the power duration curve so that I'm utilizing the modeled metrics, but I am doing the testing to ensure that the modeled metrics are accurate by picking up the curve in low points. If you watch the webinar I had on slide 30, whatever it was, it explains how to do that. Okay. I think that's all the question. Oh, wait. Cool. I think that's all the questions. Now's your last chance to ask them. Everybody else, thank you everybody for attending. Again, I'm sorry about the delays. It was kind of a challenging January, February. We do have upcoming webinars and support resources. So I do know, and I'm going to post it tomorrow morning, that Dean Golich is going to be doing one on, can I have that in here? Dean Golich is going to be doing a webinar on, I didn't put the help pages in here, I have them here, on intervals. Dean is a master of interval analytics and interval building and stuff like that. And he's going to be doing a webinar. You can always find it. So here's resources for everybody because I know there's some new people here. This is the WKO4 education page. So you can take a screenshot of that. It's on this page you'll find how-to videos, tutorials, ebooks. We're trying to put more and more ebooks together. It's just time. Articles, and then the future webinar series. And you will see, I'm doing it for a new group of people, another individualize your training. If anybody wants to attend, I'll post it. And then we do have a TrainingPeaks University in Mallorca. And then actually in between here, it gets posted tomorrow, Dean's doing his early in March. So it'll all get posted tomorrow on intervals. Definitely one you guys should attend. He is the best at that. We do have TrainingPeaks University. We do have one in Mallorca. There's 2 slots left. If anybody's going to be in Mallorca or currently watching this or sees this on video from Europe, please feel free to join us. It's March 25th. We are doing a power training camp. This is my wife's travel company that they make me present at. And I have to actually ride my bike and not just talk, which is great. But this is a power training camp with a lot of people from this group. It's actually sold out at the moment, but if it's one of our group, we can find room for 1 or 2 more if you want. I actually think we got a cancellation today, but I can find out. I'll get you in there. I know somebody. Also, TrainingPeaks asked me to let you know, for all the TrainingPeaks coaches, the TrainingPeaks Power Certification is live. If you want Power Certification, you will get a Power Certification icon for your coaching and a Power Certification listing in your levels. It does get CEUs. I see a typo in that. I need to point out to them, but you get 4 CEUs for the completion of this course. We do have USAT credits being looked at, and that should come here shortly. So if you're looking at for that power certification, for most people on this list, it's probably pretty fundamental, but yet for the TrainingPeaks coaches, to put a power certification in your list probably is a pretty good deal. All right, now I've talked enough products. All right, everybody, thanks for a great webinar. Any questions, post them up on Facebook and we'll keep going there. Thanks, everybody. Good night.